an important area when we're talking about privacy and economic development and all of the other issues that have been touched on today, but there is not a lot of scholarship on it. So not to say this is comprehensive, but hopefully a good introduction to this topic area. So just quickly, so I threw this up here. I run this project out of Duke University in the US. The key point being sort of this last bullet. We're really building out a lot of technology policy work. And so as I talk about this last project here that I run looking at data brokers, we also have several other projects on international privacy, on tech and gender violence, on accountability for social media platforms. So we try to think about these things sort of from an ecosystem perspective. So what are we talking about when we're talking about data brokers in this idea of the data economy? So we have here our user, our individual with a smartphone who is using online services. And so the vast majority of our policy conversation, and I say our, I think meaning globally in the US certainly, but also in many other countries, focuses on this connection right here. When I log on to Facebook, I give my data directly to Facebook. When I open up a ride-sharing app, I give my data to a ride-sharing app, a payment service, et cetera. It's about that direct transfer of data from a consumer to a business that you're interacting with. That's where a lot of the conversation focuses. After that data transfer happens, though, there's actually an entire ecosystem of actors acquiring, analyzing, buying, selling, sharing that data with one another that often escapes the policy conversation. And that's where our research focuses. So you have apps and platforms sending data to third-party advertisers. You have real-time bidding networks for ads. How those work is if I'm, say, Facebook, and I want to get the most money possible for selling an ad to a company to target a consumer, I'll let all these different companies bid at the same time on the ad. And in doing so, I'll give them information about people. You have data brokers, which I'll talk about, whose business model is just buying and selling people's data. This is a huge market in the US. It's also a huge market in India. In both cases, it doesn't really get much media coverage or policy attention. And then they might share with software development kits and other things, right? So, then beyond that, you have data brokers selling data to all these other actors, insurance firms, banks, law enforcement, criminals even. All to say, when we start up here, that's an easier relationship for the average consumer to understand. Okay, I log onto a website, I'm giving up some information. What we don't think about is that once that company has it, in the US and in India, there are basically no restrictions on their ability to sell and share it with all of these other actors down here. And all of a sudden, I thought I was just, ordering food off an app. And next thing you know, my GPS location is being sold to an insurance company. So that's sort of this data economy picture. Right, so as I just said, right, we think about sort of that direct first party relationship. Oh, okay, well, we can all enjoy that Zuckerberg photo there. I forgot I had that here. Right, so all these apps were used to collecting our information, but there is this second layer, hidden layer to that surveillance that doesn't get attention, and that's what our project focuses on, is researching and understanding these firms and understanding the harms that this can produce. So this is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. So you have single companies alone worth, hundreds of millions or billions of US dollars, whose entire business is just buying up people's information and then selling it to other companies or to governments or to individuals. And so when we talk about data privacy, again, we focus a lot on a few big platforms, and there's a good reason to do that, but there's this entire massive worldwide industry that's just buying and selling people's information as well. Now, so in the United States, there are hundreds of companies whose entire model is buying and selling data, which we call data brokers. I obviously am not the expert on the Indian data brokerage ecosystem. I've seen estimates that it's a similar size, that there are hundreds of companies, if not thousands, doing this. You also have thousands and thousands of other companies who sell, license, and share data with data brokers. So your whole business might be buying and selling data, or it might be a part of your business. Facebook bought and sold data like this for a long time. Basically, every major internet provider in the United States sells data on its own customers, in addition to selling them internet services. So more and more companies are making this a part of their profit model. And this is really the big point. I'll get into this more. This happens with virtually no regulation. And again, that's because most policymakers and sort of the media discourse focuses on that first party collection. It doesn't think about this whole ecosystem and supply chain of data. So this of course raises the question, how on earth these companies get this information in the first place? And there's really three main ways that data brokers get information on individuals. So the first is direct collection. As I mentioned, there are companies who will get data from users directly and then go sell it. There was, I think it was a 2006 case in India of a company that was getting information directly from its users and then was turning around and selling it to all these other people without those users' knowledge. And so that was a scandal. We had this recently in the US too. Last year, there was a media story that this app, which called itself a family safety app, was turning around and secretly selling the GPS locations of parents and children to all of these other companies behind their back. So you have companies that will get things directly from users and then sell it. Oracle is a great example of this. Most of us probably think of Oracle as a software and cloud company, and they certainly still do software. But in the last 7 or 8 years, they've made a huge shift towards buying and selling people's information. So Oracle owns dozens and dozens and dozens of companies that get information directly from people, and then Oracle pools it all together and then just sells it all over the place. The second main way these companies get people's information is secondary collection. So once the first company has it, then we'll buy it from them. Then we'll license it from them, right? One example is a large data broker, Verisk, has all of this marketing material about smart devices, video cameras, doorbells, surveillance systems in homes, smart speakers, thermostats, that can all feed into its platform for it to buy and sell and analyze data on people. So again, you have consumers in this scenario, buying a smart speaker, buying a fitness wearable, putting IoT devices in their home, not thinking that once it goes into that device, it's going to all these other companies, including people who buy and sell it. And then the third way data brokers get data is inference. And this is predicting a person's characteristics based on this other data. And this too is extremely concerning. So, for example, there are many companies who will basically guess an individual's religion or sexual orientation or income level or other highly sensitive pieces of information based on their travel activity, for example, right? Do you go to a particular place of worship? Do you go to a gay bar? Do you go to a marriage counselor on GPS? Or they can look at your online search history, right? If there are a lot of companies, whether we know it or not, that buy and sell our entire internet search history. And so you can imagine if anyone was able to get that, they can probably figure out your political leanings and all kinds of different things about you. So if this isn't creeping you out already, who cares, right? Well, there are several very, very clear harms that are already going on because of this. And the first one is stalking and violence. So here I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the US case that I've studied, but these issues apply, I think, globally. So our research at Duke has found data brokers openly and explicitly advertising data on people's whereabouts, their family members, their relatives, and their historical and even real-time smartphone GPS locations. So if you get access to this information, which you can, a lot of these companies will sell it to you with an email address and a credit card number. If you want to hurt somebody, knowing where they are is a pretty good way to get there. And so there have been many, many, many cases in the US of abusive individuals that find where other people are through data brokers and then use that to hunt them down and stalk, harass, intimidate, even murder those people. Women have quite literally been killed in the US because an abuser is able to buy their location off a company off the internet and then go find them. So there are already real physical safety and violence risks occurring and harms occurring because it's so easy to buy people's data. Another case in the US recently, there was this Catholic website that bought all of this GPS location data on a closeted priest. He was, he is gay and was not publicly out. And so they bought this without his knowledge or certainly consent. They went and bought this GPS data off this open market and literally followed him around as he went to meet up with people and then outed him. And so again, this is just a different variation of the same problem, which is if you can so easily go buy people's locations and other things off the internet, you can actually find them and cause all kinds of harm to them. Right, like we can imagine this is in a sort of extreme, violent extremism context. We can imagine this in a all kinds of different scenarios. So another category of harm here is consumer exploitation. So we're already worried, right, about companies that collect our data directly exploiting consumers using algorithmic pricing, other things, right? This also happens as a result of data brokers and people buying and selling data. So again, a few US examples, and then I'll talk about India, but I think this just captures the problem. So there are health insurance companies in the US that, and which are global companies also, that buy data on millions of Americans off the open market. They will buy up data on people's race and ethnicity, on their gender, on their sex, on their sexual orientation, on their income level, to basically calculate how much they can charge people for health insurance. And so that obviously produces serious harm. And you have companies who, by the way, who will claim that they don't do pricing with it, but they'll, feed into things that do determine pricing. There have also been cases in the US of people being denied housing because they will apply for, to live in an apartment or something like that. The building will go buy data on them from a data broker, like to do a background check, and there will be incorrect information in there, and they will use that to reject that person's housing application. And oftentimes these people do not know that their data is being bought. They don't even know that data is out there. They don't know why their application was denied. They don't even have any form of recourse for correcting it. And then you also have a criminal side to this. There have been scammers and other individuals in the US who will go buy this data on people and exploit them. There are people who will go buy data on individuals with Alzheimer's and dementia and use those to scam them out of their savings. There are people who go buy data on former members of the military and use that to try and steal from their families. There have been all kinds of cases of this as well. And so, right, as we look at this picture, abusive and violent people are exploiting this data market. There are companies exploiting this data market. There are criminals exploiting this data market. It's really a broad set of harms. And so just generally, right, every time you use an app, all of these other companies possibly are getting access to that information because there isn't sufficient regulatory control. This could be third-party advertisers, third-party code. A few years ago, there was a story exposing that Facebook was secretly getting data on women's menstrual cycles. And people were understandably confused because they were not putting their, personal health information into Facebook. But it turns out that this other completely separate health app that that many women were using had some, quiet partnership with Facebook. And so women downloaded this other app and were using it to, assist with various menstrual health and personal health activities. And, unbeknownst to them, this was going to Facebook, who then probably was using it to target ads and all kinds of other things. Again, no regulation and no consumer notice. Right, as I said, there's also the sale. It's not just sharing, it's that you can sell data. This is a huge issue in the US because law enforcement agencies will buy data on citizens, on US citizens, in order to circumvent getting a warrant. So, if I'm a US federal law enforcement agency and I want to get a bunch of people's GPS locations, I usually have to go through the court system. I have to put in for a warrant. However, if I go to a company that sells people's GPS data, a middleman that goes to a phone company, buys it up, and then hands it to law enforcement, I don't need a warrant, and I don't need to tell anybody I did it. And so that's a huge problem. Um, but generally, and I think this is an important reminder when we're talking about surveillance, you probably could take out the US government here and put in any government, right? People in power who have surveillance tools usually discriminately, if not exclusively, weaponize that surveillance against marginalized groups. We've seen this in many, many countries and many, many historical contexts, right? Surveillance is a weapon. There are a lot of power dynamics at play. And so there's that broader harm as well. I have a few more slides here and then we can open for questions. So last year I published this report on looking at 10 major data brokers and the information they sell. So these are some of the largest of these companies. They, as you can see sort of here, they advertise for sale people's sensitive demographic information, race, religion, gender, they sell all that stuff. They sell people's political preferences and beliefs, which candidates you support, which parties you support, maybe even how you voted. If you're an active voter, if you're not an active voter. They sell people's locations and whereabouts. They sell data on members of the military, on government employees, on students, on children, on healthcare workers, on all kinds of segments of the population. This report was mainly written for a US policy audience, but what I'll say is many of these companies advertise global data sets. So Axiom, which is one of the largest data brokers on the planet, advertises data on literally billions of people around the world. And on each of these people, it says it generally has anywhere from thousands to tens of thousands of characteristics. So if you go in their marketing documents, and you can find India and many other countries in there, they will list out, here are all the places in the world where we can sell you data on people. And I really want to hammer that home, right? Thousands of data points is an insane amount of information, because I'm pretty sure if we unmuted right now, we went around and we said, everyone name 10 fun facts about yourself. We could probably do that pretty quickly. If I said name 100 fun facts about yourself, most of us, myself included, would probably get to 20 or 30 and then have to think harder, right? These companies have thousands of data points on a single person. That is an insane amount of information. So that's sort of like the scope and the global depth of this, global breadth of this surveillance. So I'll talk about the US and then I'll talk about India. So in the US, there's no strong, comprehensive national privacy law. There just isn't. There are some privacy laws at the state level. Only 2 address this sort of data economy, this open data market. All they do, though, is make companies post their names on, a state website. They describe data brokers in a very narrow way. So if you sell data on your own customers, you're automatically not covered by the law, which seems kind of ridiculous because it is. They also, as I said, only make companies register. A narrow definition of companies register. They don't actually stop them from buying and selling information. And the problem generally is that the open data market allows government, companies, et cetera, to circumvent the few privacy laws that do exist. There aren't that many strong ones in the US, but the few that exist, people can walk right around them because a middleman will sell you data. In India, if folks are not familiar with this story, this is a really, really great one from last year, very long, in the Rest of World publication by 2 journalists, looking at the dark data economy in India. Essentially, the regulatory issues are, it's not the same landscape, obviously, but are similar to the US, where there aren't too many privacy controls on data in India. Of course, that's part of the reason for the Personal Data Protection Bill in Parliament. But this article really dives into, there are a ton of companies in India that buy and sell people's information without their consent and without their knowledge. They sell it to all kinds of exploitative entities. And again, most of the laws that exist are pretty narrow, and they don't think about the entire data economy. They think about consumer A directly giving information to company B, and that's basically it. So I'll just say the reason I put this up here is because this goes very in depth. And as I said, I'm certainly not the expert here on this per se. Before I wrap here, quickly just want to mention this. So another hat I wear is at the Atlantic Council think tank in DC. And we've been running this US-India digital trade initiative. So we've been partnering with a bunch of former Indian officials and scholars and industry experts, and having the same on the US side to talk about digital trade. And so just actually 2 days ago, I came out with this paper off of our data policy working group. And so we convened a bunch of US and Indian industry stakeholders, civil society experts, some former government people to talk about US-India data cooperation. So, you know, I figured I'd throw this in because this, of course, relates to, you know, where both countries are on the data economy and on privacy. So, you know, when we think about how do the US and India think about data issues at a high level, of course, there are many strategic differences, right? There's a difference of opinion on the cyber sovereignty concept. There is a really strong split on data localization. There's also the notion of digital colonialism, right? The US, which, you know, I would agree with this, right, has done a terrible job regulating its large tech companies. And so they, you know, these companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, can just go into other markets and you know, surveil all these people. Operationally, when we talk about how can the US and India do better on this data economy and on privacy, there are many challenges as well. The MLAT process, the process for Indian law enforcement to get data from US firms to investigate crimes and do their jobs, is pretty broken. The US does not have a strong privacy law. The US has pretty aggressively lobbied against the data localization provisions in the Personal Data Protection Bill. You know, sometimes we're just rejecting things without even listening to what India has to say. And then on the other side, I think the Indian government has been just reluctant to engage the US government on the data bill. To be clear, these are my own opinions, but this sort of draws on this working group that I mentioned. And so there are other issues in, you know, tackling these data privacy challenges generally. You know, in the US, the Federal Trade Commission, which is the main enforcement body for privacy, doesn't have enough money and it doesn't have enough personnel. And so when you don't have money and you don't have enough people, it's kind of hard to enforce laws that you already have around privacy. The US Congress is also completely dysfunctional. So, you know, there's been talk for decades about US privacy protections and legislation, and that basically has gone nowhere. And similarly, it's hard to get more money for the people who should enforce the existing privacy rules. You know, right, there's also the problem of internet shutdowns, the Modi government's orders to social media companies, et cetera, in India, that present challenges. There's also the question of the EU, right? When the US and India think about data policy, both of our countries, of course, have to think about the EU. The US has had a lot of challenges, right, with the EU giving adequacy. There's a question if India will get adequacy if it passes the Personal Data Protection Bill, et cetera. And so, what I argue in this paper and what our working group of US and Indian, civil society and academic and industry experts decided on sort of is that, right, there's a ton of opportunity for the US and India to cooperate on data policy, right? Both countries are leading powers. They have global leadership in technology. And we have a lot of shared interests, right? Concern about other countries, wanting to improve healthcare with data, et cetera. As I've talked about today, we both have to grapple with this entire open data market and the supply chain of data. So there's a lot of common ground there. And so the recommendation we made was for, the US and India to build off the renewed trade policy forum dialogues, which of course were stalled for a bit, and sort of reinvigorate the conversation about these data issues to focus really on sort of tactical near-term things that we can get done, talking about data localization and processing proposals, talking about the MLAT law enforcement issues, talking about cybersecurity. Because again, this, it doesn't get a lot of attention. These kinds of data economy issues are facing every country. They certainly are manifesting in different ways, and different countries have to set their own paths forward. But I think there is real opportunity for not only academic collaboration on this issue and things like that, but also for the governments to cooperate around the future of privacy as well. So with that, I will stop sharing and open the floor for any thoughts or questions.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, for that, concise and concise view, and several new threads that you brought up. So yes, we would love to take some questions. So let's see. Yes, Varun, please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And it's great to connect with you, Justin, on this really important topic. And it'll be really great to also talk to you separately about your paper. Just to give a brief background, I work at NASSCOM as part of their public policy team, and we do a lot of work on digital trade and data policy in both domestic and international issues. I actually had two questions that I was hoping to pose to you. The first one was on data brokers, your work on data brokers that you mentioned. And the second one was on your thoughts around the international data transfers stuff that you were talking about in the second half. On data brokers, so we've seen that globally because of the GDPR, there have been introduction of new rights regarding right to be forgotten that has seen multiple flavors in different jurisdictions, erasure, deletion, etc., or just a non-indexing. And I wanted to know if in your research you had explored the possibility of these rights being utilized by individual consumers and citizens to sort of reclaim a little bit of control from the data brokerage industry. Has this actually happened? Has this even been explored? And just to quickly jump to the data transfers aspect, do you think that it is possible right now for a country like India to strive towards data partnerships with the US and also at the same time strike the possibility of an adequacy partnership? Is that even possible right now, given where the US EU conversation on data transfer lies? And that's, I think, the really tough question that we face on a day-to-day basis of figuring out how a country like India can navigate that, given that it wants to be seen as a trading partner for both nations that have very different approaches on privacy currently.
Yeah, those are both really great questions. So on the first one on data brokers, there have so again, I don't have too much to draw on here, sort of as you said, right? Not too many places have implemented robust controls in this way to have a good sample, but we did in our project get some limited data on data brokers' responses to data deletion requests, and the response rate is horrible. I would have to find the exact number, but we've done work with this company, Mine, that tracks this stuff. And if you compare data brokers' response to a consumer saying, please delete my information, to responses by many other types of companies, data brokers are way less responsive. So that's sort of the first thing is there isn't, it would be good to get more data, but the limited data we do have suggests they're not very responsive. The other comment, though, to make on your point, and I think you sort of hit on this, is it is an important way to give consumers a little more control to say, you can go to a company and see what they have on you, for example. But when we're talking about, at least my personal view is when we're talking about these companies and this data market, these firms have so much power that it's not, from a policy standpoint, sufficient to put the burden on individuals to say, guess what, consumer, there are literally thousands of companies selling your data that you've never heard of and you don't even know exist and you don't even know what they have on you, but you have to go file all these deletion requests to make sure they're not selling your GPS location to, your health insurance provider or to someone who wants to, find you. But I think it's an important question, right? Because as we, like you said, we see that sort of modeled in more and more privacy legislation around the world. And right, like certainly even Brazil's new law draws on a lot of GDPR. So yeah, I think that's an important question to ask. On the second, on adequacy, right? I mean, I'd be intellectually dishonest if I pretended like I knew, as you said. So many of us who follow this, we're not sure. And as you said, it'd be great to chat more about this. But I mean, my sense, I think sometimes in the US, at least, we overestimate how much it would take to get adequacy from a lot of folks in the EU. I've had this conversation with a few years ago with some of the folks who were sort of in charge of GDPR enforcement, and they made that exact comment of, probably you're overestimating how much it would take to have us say that's a sufficient privacy control. So all to say, I think the US is going to renegotiate Privacy Shield with the EU. My understanding is those conversations are going well, even though they're still very much ongoing. Then the question being, as you said, could India get adequacy? I also think that's possible. But again, I think the question comes back to the split we see in the EU, which is, some people say this is great, you get adequacy, and then the courts say this is insufficient and knock it down.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah, Justin, I have a question that in an economic sense, right? It appears really weird. I mean, maybe there's another word for it, but in that there's so much redundancy that, say, from one phone, there's so many apps that one downloads that, from one phone and one person, there's so many ways that the same person's data is being sold and resold, right? So there's a redundancy in the fact that, out of hundreds of apps that we download, each one of them is taking out data and then selling it, right? So isn't that creating any kind of economic, issue, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we also, in our data warehouses, we are sort of downloading all that data, storing it. So is it that so much wastage, right? Economic waste, data waste, in all kinds of things happening. When aren't we putting just on the data supply side part of it? Aren't we thinking about this even a little more carefully? Why store so much data which is redundant?
Right. Right. So even beyond the harms, which, as I said, are enough reason to regulate, yeah, there is a lot of inefficiency, like you said, from a economic standpoint. That's even one of the questions about some of these data brokers, is their data sets end up being somewhat similar because they are buying from similar sources. And so, yeah, there's multiple companies offering things that are different, but there's a strong, overlap in the middle of that Venn diagram of the data that they do have. And then, yeah, again, it's a weird thing, right? Because for a small app, the reason a lot of these smaller companies and apps sell the data is not because they, love the data brokerage industry per se and say, I want to help people get targeted or whatever. But to your point of sort of the economic calculus, the marginal value of the data for them is extremely small. If I'm a random, franchise of a car dealership in some city in the north of the country, and I have data on 2,000 customers, I can't really do too much with that, because if somebody just bought a car, they're not going to buy another car in the next month, right? So that's not really helpful to me. And that's the reason these companies will go sell it to a larger data broker, is because, or go through somebody that sells it to a larger data broker, because they'll say, but what I can do is I can make some money off of this and give it to someone who can generate economic value, because then they say, okay, we're going to track everyone who bought a car, and then we'll sell that to run ads on car repairs, and we'll sell that to someone trying to profile people's income level and all kinds of other things. So yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think, like you had said from the outset, there's a lot of limited scholarship on this. And I think folks like yourself and others who bring that political economy view to this would add a lot to these kinds of dynamics.
Right. Yeah, because at the back end, there's all this discussion about, climate change, and, a lot of the argument around climate change is about reducing energy for the data warehouses. But then if you're actually ending up storing redundant data, that's also part of the, equation, right? That why spend so much energy to begin with in, collecting so much data, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So yes, we have time for a few more questions. I'm sure there are questions.
Well, whether there are or not, I can also look in the chat here that story I mentioned on the Indian data brokerage ecosystem, and I'll also put our project page here, which has some of our research.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you.
Yeah, and if anyone, certainly I can put my email here too, if anyone would like to chat further. Like you said, though, it is interesting, right? That seems to be a similarity across countries, is in the US, this sort of broader supply chain of data and data brokers don't get a lot of conversation. I know it doesn't get a ton, as you and I have talked about in India, and then even talking to EU counterparts who say, it doesn't really get that much attention here. It's mainly about the big platforms. And again, those are things we should focus on, certainly, right? There's lots of reasons to talk about the big firms, but we also have to talk about the underlying ecosystem.
Yeah, true. Yeah, Sandeep, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so, Justin, you did say that one of the things about data brokers is that many people don't really know that they exist. And there are a lot of policy discussions that happen in the interactions with customers or users with the primary data collectors, and the controls and regulation seems to focus on that aspect. So what kinds of suggestions do you have in terms of controls to regulate this data broker industry? And given the fact that you do have a considerable familiarity with the proposed Indian Data Protection Act, what are the controls that you think need to come in here? Is there a gross area that the drafters of this bill have missed in dealing with data broker regulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, right, there's certainly a lot we could talk about with the personal data protection bill. I think, as you said, most of the provisions for companies focus on direct collection, right? Talking about data fiduciaries, social media companies, different controls for storage and processing and outbound transfer for entities that get data directly from consumers. You don't really see talk of selling data in there. And that, like I said, that's a blind spot in the US too, is a lot of bills I'll review or others put out don't talk about that either. I think the solution in some of these cases is to consider bans on the sale of the highest sensitivity categories of information. So for example, GPS data. The data broker argument for buying and selling people's GPS data without their consent is that it allows companies to target ads better. So if I'm walking down the street and I'm 20 feet from a coffee shop, I get a web ad for a coupon to go into the coffee shop, or sort of understanding like foot traffic to stores and things like that. On the cost side, the harms are huge. As I said, there are people, at least in the US, all the time, there are domestic violence harms. People are stalked because their data is bought up. Companies use it to exploit. Law enforcement uses it. So that's a category where the costs are much higher than the benefits. And so you could literally just say to ban the sale of it. And again, that's not saying that a rideshare app can't use your GPS location. That's not saying a Maps app can't use your GPS location. It's just saying, if I'm a consumer and I consent to a business using this data, you can't then go sell it to all these other people. And so that's really sort of what our position has been on the regulation. There are other controls you can put in place, but for some things like GPS data, health data, which I know the US and India both consider highly sensitive, you could ban the sale. Right now in the US, you can go buy off the open market someone's entire surgical history. You can go buy conditions on their mental health, databases on people's mental health. I mean, it's horrible stuff. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think like identifying the highest sensitivity data areas and then just banning the sale of data outright is sort of a good policy approach.
Yeah, which is probably worth looking at the act to see if there are provisions that can be construed to mean you can't sell data, because there is regulation in India. In another area, when we found there was lots of malpractices in organ transplantation, we brought in regulation to say that an individual can't consent to organ transplantation, to selling organs, unless there's some level of family consent as well. So there are some things that are so harmful that an individual's consent is not considered enough.
Right.
So I guess we just haven't looked into the language of the bill to see if somehow some of that language implies you can't sell. And if it isn't there, then it's some kind of a gap that needs to be filled.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say, and that's a great point too, is some of these regulations are written controlling data transfers from one entity to another instead of making it agnostic to the entity. And that's kind of, as you just hit on, that's exactly part of the issue too, is if you say a specific category of health provider can't give away this information, well, some company that's not technically in that category can set up and then be able to transfer without running into restrictions. That's what a lot of these companies do in the US.
Okay, so we have time for maybe one more question, if there's anyone. Yes, Suraj, please go ahead.
Thank you, Justin, for the insights. Just I am curious to know that since you have extensively worked on the data brokers companies, like their working patterns, their economic ways. Like, have you ever come across any companies that are not really into impersonation of data kind of, but rather they are storing or they are selling data that is not related to any personal data, and whether these companies are profitable in that way?
To sell like non-personal identifiable data?
Yeah, non-personal, non-identifiable kind of data.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are companies who will sell what they call anonymized data. I think that for a variety of reasons is a sort of nonsense term, right? Because as plenty of privacy scholars have shown, it's way too easy to just reattach things to people's names. But there are companies who sell aggregated stuff, and they are profitable. Foot traffic is a great example. So in the GPS data selling space, there are companies who will buy up and aggregate all the foot traffic in a local market or a mall or something like that. And then they can sell to people and say, we can tell you which stores are most popular at which times. We can tell you where people go on this day of the week versus this day of the week. So to your point, there are companies that sell that stuff. People buy it, they find it useful. Again, though, I think, sort of the thing for us to ask is, does that mean there's no harm? And in a lot of these cases, there is still harm that occurs because of that. But there are companies who will sell without someone's, direct name attached.